even dealing with all these extra struggles, you managed to work on negotiations towards normalization. What was that like?
Well, the Nixon visit to Beijing created a problem for us because we hadn't informed the Japanese about what we were doing, and they were deeply offended. So that when President Nixon visited China in 1972, Japan responded by establishing diplomatic relations with China in 1972. And other countries were establishing diplomatic relations with China as the Vietnam War ended, with many of the Asian countries that had not recognized China establishing diplomatic relations. But we had the Taiwan issue as a blocking factor. So we would have created a terrible situation for ourselves if we had opened the floodgates to international recognition of China while we ourselves couldn't complete the process of shifting our recognition of the government of China from the Republic of China in Taiwan, that clearly only controlled the island of Taiwan, while Beijing was the capital of mainland China, where most Chinese lived, and which was basically China. So we somehow had to complete the process of normalization. But the problem was that to do that, we had to figure out how to handle our relationship with Taiwan. The Chinese insisted that we had to break our diplomatic relationship with China. That's the one China policy, and that was a Chinese policy. Both the Republic of China and Beijing were equally insistent that you could only have official relations with one of them and not with both of them. I was in Taiwan, for example, in 1964, in the American embassy there, when the French established diplomatic relations with Beijing, but didn't break relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan. The Republic of China responded by breaking relations with France. It was a maneuver by the French, but it illustrated the fact that both sides of the unresolved civil war were equally insistent that there was only one official government of China. And we recognized the losing side in the Civil War, and we somehow had to correct that problem. But the terms that the Chinese set were very difficult for us to meet. We had to break relations with a friendly government. We had to end a security treaty that we had with Taiwan after the Korean War, and we had to remove our military forces from Taiwan. And quite frankly, we didn't want to meet those conditions. And for 6 years, 3 presidents tried to see if there was a better deal that was available, and it turned out there wasn't. And so President Carter decided that we would have to meet those conditions, but we were not prepared to have Taiwan left simply as a walkover for China to deal with. So we insisted on continuing our arms sales to Taiwan, even after we broke relations with them. So these were the issues that we had to deal with in the normalization talks. And when we began the talks, we had no assurance that we were going to be successful in our minimum conditions. We were prepared to meet the Chinese minimum conditions, but we didn't know whether they would agree to our minimum conditions. So there was a lot of tenseness in the talks. The additional complicating factor was secrecy was absolutely necessary. We had told the top members of Congress before we began the negotiations that we were prepared to meet the 3 terms: break relations with Taiwan, end the security treaty, and remove our military forces. And they had said, you're doing the right thing, but we will criticize you. In other words, they didn't want to be seen as approving something that they knew the United States had to do in order to protect our position in Asia and, frankly, in the world. So if news of the talks had come out, we would have had a raft of criticism from
Right.
people who actually thought we were doing the right thing. But to do it, we had to do it in secrecy. And this meant that only a handful of people in Washington were aware that we were engaged in the negotiations. And Ambassador Woodcock, I was his advisor in the negotiations, had to do this behind the backs of our fellow American employees in the liaison office. So it was an awkward situation. The Chinese would not handle the talks the way we wanted them to. We had broken the issues into 4 different sections, and we wanted to present one section and get the Chinese response and then deal with the second section and get the Chinese response. They said, no, you've got to lay your cards on the table. So over a period of 4 months, we patiently outlined what our position was on continuing unofficial relations with Taiwan in other respects. And the big issue that we knew was the most troublesome one had to do with selling arms to Taiwan. But we covered that also in a way that Washington had approved, which dealt with it very diplomatically, but was clear. And after we had completed our presentation, when we were invited to the next meeting where we were expected to get the Chinese response, we were told that the foreign minister was not available, that he was sick, and that we would meet with the deputy foreign minister. And we've been conducting all the negotiations with the foreign minister. So what did that mean? Did that mean that they were sending a signal to us that they were not satisfied with our position and therefore downgrading the talks? Or did it mean that the foreign minister was really sick and we had to meet with the deputy foreign minister? So we consulted with Washington and mutually agreed that we should go ahead with the session. And the session went well. They gave a positive response to what we had laid on the table and told us that Deng Xiaoping would want to meet with us soon, which then got awkward because I was planning a vacation with my wife in southern China, and Ambassador Woodcock didn't want me to leave Beijing until we knew when the meeting with Deng Xiaoping would be. So we waited about 10 days, and then we had a series of 5 meetings with Deng Xiaoping over the course of 3 days, in which we wrapped up the negotiations. But when we wrapped them up, Washington came back to us and said, are you absolutely certain that Deng Xiaoping understands that we will be continuing arms sales to Taiwan? And that was the core issue. And Ambassador Woodcock and I consulted with each other and both agreed that they should have interpreted our language the way it was intended to be interpreted, but we couldn't exclude the possibility that Deng Xiaoping had chosen to read into it what he wanted it to be rather than what we wanted it to be. So we gave that opinion back to Washington, and they said, go in and see Deng again and tell him we intend to continue arms sales to Taiwan after normalization. And that was a very tough meeting. Deng was outraged. He had not understood that at all. And everything seemed to be handling in the balance. And finally he calmed down and said to Woodcock, what should we do? And Woodcock said, we can't solve this issue here. We can handle it better if we have a diplomatic relationship than if we don't have a diplomatic relationship. And Deng said, okay. And that's how we produced the agreement to establish diplomatic relations. It was a tough period, and we also then had the problem of dealing with our staff, who quite understandably resented the fact that something of earth-shattering importance had been done behind their backs. That was very relevant to them. But they were professionals and they understood. And I understood their attitudes because that's the way I would have felt if I had been in their shoes.
And then Woodcock stayed on as the first official ambassador, correct?
That's correct. He was the best negotiator I've ever seen in operation. He, of course, he was the former head of the United Auto Workers
Mm-hmm.
and had carried very big, important negotiations with each of the three major U.S. auto companies. Uh, and I also learned from the experience that it is very helpful if your negotiator has earned the respect of the other side. And Woodcock had earned the respect of the Chinese side. And it made a difference. People don't like to reach agreement on a difficult issue with people they dislike,
Mm.
because then that somehow gives credit to the other side for having reached the agreement, and that's the way humans are. The personal feelings can get in the way of important issues.